I'm Priya Mann, and today we're talking to Phil Lebeau, who is a reporter who works extensively in the auto and airline industry. Today we're looking at the auto industry with the impact of tariffs on the way. Phil, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Phil, why don't we just get right into it? When it comes to consumers, what do you think the impact is going to be, whether you're looking to buy a car now or in the near future?
Remains to be seen in terms of ultimately how much of the cost of the 25% tariffs are passed along through dealers to consumers. There has been some discussion about whether or not automakers will spread out that cost over the entire portfolio of vehicles. And if that's the case, would it be a $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 increase in terms of pricing on those vehicles? Will the dealers and the automakers have to pull back on incentive spends? Otherwise, they're going to be cutting into their profit margins. There's really more unknowns than knowns at this point, which raises the question, if you're in the market for a new vehicle, should you buy now or should you wait? There is the potential that prices could go up, let's say a month, 2 months, 3 months from now, especially if these tariffs are put in place and they remain in place. There is also the potential that the tariffs may not fully go into effect, or they may only be in effect for a few weeks, and then the president decides, look, I've seen some changes in the trading posture from Canada, Mexico, other countries. We're going to pull those tariffs off. So there's no certainty here, which is, I know that's not what consumers want to hear, but at this point, it's still unclear exactly what will happen with pricing of new vehicles.
You know, as you mentioned, there are so many unknowns. Which of the big three do you think might be most impacted by these tariffs?
Well, in terms of production, clearly the most production, domestic production, is with Ford. And in theory, they should be the least impacted because they're importing fewer vehicles from Canada and from Mexico as compared to General Motors. So that's the nuts and bolts in terms of percentage of vehicles built in the United States versus vehicles that are built outside of the United States. But it still remains to be seen exactly what's going to happen in terms of tariffs on things like engines and key components that go into the vehicles. So how much of that ultimately one automaker passes along to the auto dealer, who then has to decide if they're going to pass it along to the consumer, that remains to be seen.
I think you've already hit on it, but if we're looking at some specifics here, as you know, the auto industry is global. Parts can be coming from different countries. Can you give us some example of vehicles that could be impacted here when you have parts, say an engine coming from Mexico, what that impact could be here?
Well, and that's part of what needs to be worked out as part of the trade executive order that was issued by the White House. Exactly how much of a tariff will be put. We know it's 25%, but what needs to be clarified is exactly what components within a vehicle are going to be exempt because they are made in the United States versus made in Canada or made in Mexico. In terms of vehicles, the automakers have a number of very popular vehicles that are made in all three countries. The Chevy Silverado is a good example. So for General Motors, the discussion is how much of the Silverado production that is in Mexico or the Silverado production that is in Canada, how much of that can be moved to the plants here in the United States, like in Fort Wayne, Indiana? Is there spare capacity so we could build more of these in Indiana and dramatically drop the hit from tariffs? That's one of the calculations that the auto executives are considering right now.
You know, on that note, the UAW has endorsed these tariffs. What's your reaction to that?
Sure. I would expect nothing less. The UAW wants as much production and as many jobs here in the United States. That's what the union fights for. And from their perspective, if the president is successful in forcing automakers to bring more production into the United States, whether it's by expanding production on an existing line or at an existing plant, or ultimately forcing automakers to say, we're going to build a new plant somewhere, that's good news for the UAW because it will increase the membership rolls and it gives them what they're looking for, which is a greater say in terms of production of vehicles.
But when we're talking about costs, which is part of the reason why a lot of these manufacturers have gone elsewhere, do you anticipate a hit there? It could be a win for UAW workers in the short term, but in the long term, it could increase prices for these companies.
If these tariffs stick, there will be higher costs for the automakers. That's not debatable at all. They will face higher costs. And so the question becomes, how do they offset that? Do they pass it along to the consumer? Or does the White House say, you can't pass this along to the consumer, you're going to have to eat this? Does it mean that you see lower margins or potentially losses for automakers because they have dramatically higher costs once these tariffs are factored in?
I can only imagine how difficult it is for these companies to plan. We know many of these car companies plan in 5-year increments, and now when you have a wrench like this thrown in, I mean, how do you even plan for that?
It's not easy because the calculation, the debate right now for auto executives is this. The president would like to see more auto production in the United States. He would love to see them build a new plant somewhere, let's say in the Midwest or in Michigan. If you were an auto executive and you say, let's put a new plant here in the U.S., minimum, 2.5 to 3.5 years, and that's at lightning speed in order to find a site, get everything going, build it, get production up and going. 2.5 to 3.5 years minimum, more likely closer to 4 years. Well, are you confident that the president's tariffs, are going to be in effect all 3.5, 4 years? And what happens if there's an election and a Democratic nominee comes in? Well, now you're looking at them possibly saying, we're getting rid of these tariffs. Well, you've already committed billions of dollars to this new plant. That's why it's not an easy decision for the auto executives in terms of how to deal with this and also deal with the demands of the White House.
In the short term, I know we're talking about 3 or 4 years away, but in the short term, what would your advice be to consumers?
Well, it depends on where you are in terms of your own personal finances. Look, if you were considering to buy a new vehicle, you may want to look at buying one now as opposed to waiting a couple of months. You're kind of rolling the dice. If these tariffs go into effect and they stick, there's a decent chance that some of this higher cost will be passed along through the dealer to you, the buyer. Does that mean the price is going to go up $1,000 or $5,000 or $8,000? Nobody knows at this point. What you're looking for is certainty. If you can look at a new vehicle, whatever it is, and you're comfortable with that, with your personal finances right now, it may make more sense to buy right now.
And you know, we are a border town here in Detroit. We're home to the big three. Can you talk a little bit about the impact we might see here, especially in Detroit?
Well, obviously, you guys are ground zero. I mean, the big three are all based there. So the implications, you're going to feel them right away. And you've got so much production in Michigan that what happens with that production is going to be front and center. Is there a way for the automakers to increase production at some of the plants in Michigan? It depends on how much of the capacity is being used right now. The White House believes there's excess capacity, meaning you could add in more production. Is that the case? Not every plant is the same. It's easy to say, well, there's excess capacity. Some plants may have excess capacity, but are they tooled to build the right vehicle that the automakers want to increase production of? These are, I mean, it's very difficult for them to make these decisions. And in Michigan, you're going to see a lot of these decisions play out.
And, you know, Michigan's also a border state. You know, Windsor is right across the border from us. You know, do you think as a border town, we are also going to be hit especially hard? Or what do you think the impact will be?
Well, now you're getting into the question, would Canada potentially issue retaliatory tariffs for vehicles that are built here in the U.S. or in Michigan and then exported and sold up in Canada? That remains to be seen. If there is a full-blown tariff war, that's not good for anybody. It's going to drive up costs across the board, both here in the United States as well as up in Canada. And look, Stellantis has a huge plant right across the border from you guys. What happens there in terms of production of minivans? And will that have to slow down? What happens with production in these foreign plants if the automakers realize, look, we're going to have to pay a higher fee here, a higher cost, and is it worth it to run 3 shifts of a particular plant with a particular vehicle? Or does it make more sense to say demand is going to slow down? Let's bring it down to 2 shifts. That will play out over the next couple of months.
And finally, you know, after those historic wins made by the UAW, and now we're talking about the future of some of these plants possibly moving to the U.S. or what happens if plants close, you know, what would your message be to workers?
Well, I don't think we're going to see any plants close. You're certainly not going to see plants close in the United States. And that's why the UAW is so bullish on what the Trump administration is doing right now. If anything, you will see greater production and potentially, depending on whether or not automakers make the decision to build new plants, there is the potential that you could see even greater production in terms of more final assembly plants here in the U.S. So if you are a line worker in Michigan, you like what you're seeing right now from the Trump administration, because this is all about pushing domestic production.
You know, when you look at the big picture, because I hear what you're saying, and we've talked to so many UAW workers, especially as those negotiations were going on, is there any concern? I mean, as you mentioned, it takes time to build those plants, and this isn't an overnight fix. What that could mean in terms of if prices are going up for cars in the interim, maybe folks aren't buying as much. There's it's a ripple effect.
That's always a possibility. I mean, there is a possibility if tariffs go into effect that consumer confidence falls, that you could see lower demand. People would say, look, I don't want to pay more for a vehicle. I'm not crazy about the economy right now, whatever it may be. And you may see a drop in demand. And if that happens, then the automakers will adjust production. But this is far different than what we have seen in the past in terms of automakers potentially having to either shut down production at a plant or to close a plant because of a big drop in demand, as we saw back during the pandemic. This is a far different situation here. And so I understand that auto workers, to a certain extent, they're conditioned to say, look, I know nothing is guaranteed, even though we have a new contract that went into effect. I think that the idea that we're going to see plants closing or lines shut down, I just don't see that happening anytime soon.
Is there anything else you'd like to add as these tariffs loom? I know that you've talked about so many unknowns here. This is a very uncertain time. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. No, I think you covered it all. It's pretty straightforward, and buckle up, because the next 6 to 8 weeks are going to be really interesting once we see the tariffs actually go into effect. We're not going to see any change in demand initially, and we're not going to see any change in pricing. The automakers and auto dealers have a lot of inventory, but they're going to burn through that inventory at some point, and maybe by the 2nd week of May, 3rd week of May, we may start to see some changes in pricing. That remains to be seen, and it also remains to be seen exactly how long it takes for the fine print to come in on these tariffs, and does the president stick to these tariffs? Is it permanent, as he said it would be, or is there a possibility that 6 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now, the president makes a decision, I'm not going to keep these tariffs in place? We've seen some changes in terms of the trade relationship with Mexico and Canada.
Well, certainly more questions than answers. And of course, as you said, Phil, we will buckle up. Phil Lebeau, thank you so much for joining us.